Welcome to the Boxing Gossip channel. Right, Patreon request. Got 3 or 4 Patreon requests, bit of a backlog at present, and we're going to work through them over the course of the next week to 10 days or so. So let me start out by giving a shout out to Daz for his continued support via Patreon and for suggesting the following topic, which is Lennox Lewis of the Pepe career area versus Tyson Fury, the same guy who fought Vladimir Klitschko. Interesting topic for a fantasy matchup in my humble opinion. A little bit of a poison chalice when you're talking about a fighter from a previous era versus a fighter from the modern era, because in nearly every occasion 99% of fans tend to side with the guy from the historic era, and you get branded as a clueless, casual idiot if you say anything to the contrary. You know, most of these guys would have you believing that Rocky Marciano would simply be too fit and would simply have too high a punch output, you know, than a guy who was 7 or 8 stone heavier than him and a foot taller than him from the modern era. So I'm prepared for the usual selection of choice comments in the section below, and we look forward to those. But yes, Tyson Fury versus Lennox Lewis of the Pepe era, if you like. So let's start by defining that era in Lennox Lewis's career, 1992 to about 1994. So ahead of making this video, I've rewatched some fights. I've had a look at Lennox Lewis versus Oliver McCall 1. I've had a look at the Frank Bruno Lennox Lewis fight, and I've had a look at the Lennox Lewis Derek Williams fight. And this is one of the reasons that I enjoy doing these Patreon requests, as you know, as a boxing fan, it gives me reason and purpose to go and look up these fights that I don't even know if I've seen before. I mean, I've certainly seen Lewis Bruno, Lewis McCall 1. I don't think I've ever laid eyes on Lewis Derek Williams before, for example. I think that was for the British, Commonwealth and European. Oh, that could be wrong. So yeah, very, very interesting. And I think as someone who was too much of a youngster at the time, I mean, I was alive when these fights were happening, but I certainly wasn't old enough to be watching the fights or remembering the fights, I guess you could say. It's kind of interesting because when you look back at Lennox Lewis's career and you're my sort of age, you instantly think Holyfield 1, Holyfield 2, Hasim Rahman, Mike Tyson. You may even think Vitaly Klitschko. You know, some of these very, very big, memorable fights that occurred towards the end of Lennox Lewis's career. And it's very, very easy when you think back on Lennox Lewis to ignore fights like the Oliver McCall fight or the Frank Bruno fight or the Derek Williams fight. And for me, it was quite enlightening watching them, because the Lennox Lewis in those sort of fights was very, very different to the Lennox Lewis later on in his career. And I think with Lennox Lewis there needs to be a genuine sort of debate as to when Lennox's peak and when Lennox's prime actually was. You know, with fighters like Mike Tyson, there's kind of an established line as to when the consensus peak of Mike Tyson occurred. I think with someone like Lennox Lewis, it's a lot more complicated, and the general perception may actually be that Lennox was a guy who hit his peak when he was in his 30s. You know, he came into that prime as a slightly older heavyweight. Certainly from watching these fights back this morning and yesterday when I was watching them, what I would say is that for me, Lennox Lewis's athletic peak may well have been in the early to mid 90s. So when he was working with Pepe, you could have perhaps seen Lennox Lewis in his physical prime, but to my eye, his boxing pedigree, his boxing smoothness, his boxing capability was nowhere near as refined at this stage of his career as it became later on. You know, there's that period in the late 90s where he's fighting guys like Tommy Morrison, David Tua, Ray Mercer, you know, and going through, you know, real high level opposition like that. And if you watch those fights, for me, Lennox is by far the more refined boxer at that stage of his career, just my take. So for me, whilst Lennox Lewis may have been at his athletic and physical prime during the Pepe career era, if you like, for want of a better term. In terms of his boxing prime, in terms of his overall prime, I don't think that happened till quite a bit after. In fact, I would suggest that would be after he split with career after the Oliver McCall fight, and when he started working with Manny Stewart. And I don't think that Lennox became an instant hit under Manny Stewart. From what I've seen, it took a little bit of time for that style to mature. We saw what Manny Stewart did with Vladimir Klitschko, kind of reconstructing his style, almost giving him a sort of a rebirth as a fighter who approached the game in a completely different way. I'm not saying the transition was quite as stark with Lennox Lewis, but likewise, I think there was a lot of maturing that occurred in terms of his style, in terms of his boxing pedigree. And I don't think really you're seeing that full maturity in Lennox's game from a boxing standpoint until around 97, 98, those sort of years. So, that's quite a way detached from the era that we're discussing in this video, from 92 to 94. Now, in terms of comparing Lennox Lewis with Tyson Fury, clearly from a resume perspective, Lennox Lewis is well ahead of Tyson Fury. Tyson Fury has one win that would be classed as an elite win over Vladimir Klitschko, and detractors of Tyson Fury will be quick to point out that that was an aging Vladimir Klitschko who'd looked below par in his previous fight against a guy like Bryant Jennings. Other Tyson Fury wins, guys like Christian Hamer, guys like Derek Chisora, decent fighters, but nowhere near the sort of level of form that we're talking about throughout the rest of this video. So from a resume perspective, absolutely no question. In terms of athleticism, in terms of punching power, again, you'd want to side with Lennox Lewis. Absolutely no question. But obviously, when you're assessing the two guys in a head-to-head fantasy matchup, you're not necessarily saying, oh, who's got the best wins? Because in many ways, that's quite a boring video. Clearly, Lennox Lewis has the best wins. You're kind of talking about how the styles would match up and which guy would come out on top if the two guys fought. Now, I'll leave Tyson Fury till a few minutes later because I think the majority of people watching this video will be a lot more familiar with the style that he brought on the night against Vladimir Klitschko. Clearly that was a more recent win. And that's the win that the request refers to. It talks about Lewis from 92 to 94, and it talks about the Tyson Fury who fought Vlad. So we'll leave that fight for a few minutes. Let's talk about Lennox Lewis and his style. Now, I've already referred in this video that I don't think Lennox hit a boxing peak until later on in his career. I was actually surprised when we were watching some of his earlier fights, like the likes of Derek Williams, the likes of Frank Bruno. He actually looked relatively clumsy in there. And look, that's easy for me to say, sitting here on the sofa in front of the wallpaper as always, criticising an all-time great. He certainly looks a lot less clumsy than I would if I was in there, as you guys know. But for me, compared to a peak Lennox Lewis from a boxing standpoint, Lennox looks clumsy under Pepe Correa. Perhaps that was because the training was more focused on athleticism and being in physical conditioning. I don't know. But for me, just initial observations, slightly clumsy in terms of balance and punch selection, not instantly comfortable when there's pressure, a bit smothered when it gets to inside work, quite clumsy on the inside, too much smothering of work. From distance, ever so slightly ragged in terms of accuracy, ever so slightly ragged in terms of timing, and just a fighter who, for me, was lacking that sort of sharpness that we saw later on in his career. You look at that Frank Bruno fight, for me, Bruno ahead in that fight until Lennox Lewis's power tells in the later stages. But you see Frank Bruno on many occasions throughout that fight adopting the front foot fighter role, adopting the come forward fighter role. You see Lennox on the back foot. You see him taking a while to warm into the fight. You see him under pressure. You see him showing some signs of inaccuracy, some signs of clumsiness, some sort of suggestion that he was almost struggling with the range. I mean, don't get me wrong, you can look at it and you can see that Lennox is a red hot grade A prospect. You look at the jab, you look at the power, you look at the speed. Don't get me wrong, you're still looking at that footage and thinking Lennox Lewis is quite the fighter, but you're not looking at it thinking that he is as complete as he was later on in his career, which is interesting because sometimes you look at a fighter like Mike Tyson, who's often discussed with Lennox, and Tyson had such an early peak that he was at his most devastating and arguably at his most complete very, very early on in his career, in his early 20s. But for me, this Lennox Lewis, the Lennox who was fighting Bruno, the Lennox who was fighting Derek Williams, was not a guy who you would be picking to beat a peak Tyson, or not a guy you'd be picking to beat a peak Holyfield, or a peak Bowe, let's put it that way. It's only when Lennox further matured in his style and started partnering with Manny Stewart, for me, that there's that level of smoothness and class to his boxing that we kind of associate with Lennox. A few more comments on his trainer, because the request specifically referred to that. I've read up on this, I've done a little bit of research ahead of filming this video. Obviously, this isn't purely from my own memory, because as I said at the start of the video, I was a bit too young. A lot of criticism, I believe, at the time for the trainer. Lead up to the Oliver McCall fight, he'd had a few subpar defences of his title. The Bruno performance was heavily criticised. The perception was that it took Lennox too long to get going in that fight. There was kind of the perception that his trainer was a bit of a Lennox Lewis cheerleader, spent too long slagging off his opponents and spent too long trying to undermine and run down his opponents rather than actually focused on Lennox's game. So all in all, you've got a Lennox Lewis here in a far from ideal setup for me. And you've got a Lennox Lewis who, despite being a world champion, despite being an undefeated fighter prior to that McCall fight, still had a lot of developing to go. I mean, perhaps you could compare him at this stage of his career to the likes of an Anthony Joshua or the likes of a Deontay Wilder. Established world champions, several title defences, very much at the top of the sport, but you can see in them that there's more improvement to come. I don't know how old Lennox was when he fought Frank Bruno. I'm thinking he must have been 26, 27, 28, that sort of bracket. And you can see that whilst he's got so many attributes, whilst the jab's there, the power's there, the speed's there, the athleticism's there, that from a pure technical focus, there was still evolution to be done ahead of some of the more refined performances we saw later on. Now with Tyson Fury, it's different, because the Tyson Fury of the Vladimir Klitschko night lacks some of the obvious advantages that Lennox had. Lennox could change the course of a fight with a single punch. Tyson Fury is not known as a big knockout artist. Lennox, you can look at him and instantly you can see that he's an athlete. You can see the speed of his work, the snap of his work. With Tyson Fury, that's less obvious. So Lennox has huge advantages on that side of things. Having said all of that, Lennox possibly does not have the refinement in a boxing pedigree sense of a Tyson Fury from the Vladimir Klitschko fight during the period that he was taking on the likes of Frank Bruno and Derek Williams and Oliver McCall. Let's face it, this was a Lennox Lewis who was knocked unconscious by Oliver McCall. This was a Lennox Lewis who was behind on the cards against Frank Bruno. This was a Lennox Lewis who spent large portions of the Derek Williams fight smothering his work, holding, wrestling. This was not the fighter who we saw later on. Now, the Tyson Fury who fought Vladimir Klitschko, And I'll try and restrain myself here because I have too many times been referred to as a Tyson Fury fanboy. But that Tyson Fury who fought Vladimir Klitschko, for me, had a lot of attributes. You know, we talked about the fact he maybe didn't have the instant power, he didn't have the instant athleticism. Let's talk about what he could do. Could he switch from southpaw to orthodox seamlessly? Yes. Was he totally comfortable on the back foot? Yes. Is he a fighter best known for his outside game, but whose proven capability over the years to fight on the inside despite his physique? Yes. You know, the footwork, the smoothness, the timing, you know, the way he could judge and time range so that he was narrowly outside of range, that he could just take that little step, that little pivot, be back out of range. The smoothness that when an opponent's pressurising him, you know, instead of having to run around the ring doing an impression of an athlete runner, you know, he's able to just give a bit of upper body movement, turn a shoulder up, lean back, bob and weave on the ropes. You know, that kind of Tyson Fury, whilst he didn't have those instant physical attributes that Lennox had, for me, had a smoothness that a young Lennox Lewis did not have in his game. Contrast, if you will, the performance that Tyson put in against Vlad compared to the performance that Lennox put in against Bruno. In the Bruno fight, that's similarly a fight that is fought for large portions of that fight at range. That's a fight where the other fighter, Bruno or Vladimir Klitschko, is the come forward fighter looking to apply pressure from distance. And for large spells of the fight, both Lennox and Tyson Fury are operating at distance. Now for me, Tyson is instantly comfortable. He's winning rounds on the back foot. He's establishing a clear advantage over a guy like Vladimir Klitschko, who, by the way, in my opinion, just one man's opinion, but in my opinion, is by far the superior operator to a Frank Bruno. You know, we see Tyson Fury able to master the range in that fight. We see him able to master the distance. We see him being so elusive. We see his timing being totally on form. Whereas I don't see that in the Lennox Lewis of the early 90s. I see, as I've already referred to, a sort of clumsiness when it comes to assessing that distance and range, and, you know, an uncomfortableness and a sort of slight unease. He certainly lacks that smoothness for me. So for me, whilst it may be an unpopular viewpoint to take, I do see this as a very, very competitive matchup. You know, clearly Lennox is the guy who's achieved more in the sport. Clearly Lennox is the bigger puncher. Clearly Lennox deserves to go down as an all-time great. And clearly the Lennox of more recent years was a far bigger test than the Lennox operating in the early 90s. But the request has asked me, who would I pick if Tyson Fury, who fought Vlad, fought Lennox under Pepe Correa? And I've got to tell you, I see it as a very, very tough fight to call. Now, Lennox, even the Lennox of the early 90s would be the second biggest test of Tyson Fury's career. However, the Tyson Fury who fought Vlad may well be the biggest test that a Lennox Lewis would have fought by 92, 93, 94. You know, I'm not saying Tyson Fury was necessarily as formidable a test as a Holyfield, for example, but that didn't come till much later. All in all, I think that Tyson Fury, who fought Vladimir Klitschko, was a less beatable fighter than Lennox Lewis. Now, people forget about fighters' difficulties and fighters' flaws when looking back at historic fighters. The amount of times I get a comment on one of my Mike Tyson videos telling me no man could have gone past a couple of rounds with Mike Tyson during his prime. And, you know, you kind of want to say to these people, well, actually, quite a few men did go past a couple of rounds with Mike Tyson during his prime. In fact, a few of them ran him very, very close, even in his prime. But the truth of the matter is that Lennox Lewis under Pepe Correa was a very, very beatable fighter. Not only was he beaten, not only was he knocked out, but his performances in victory were very uninspired. He was drawn close by a number of fighters, and he was behind on the cards, having to rely on his power with the likes of Frank Bruno. The Lennox Lewis that came to be considered an all-time great had not yet arrived on the scene. For me, that was 3 or 4 years off when he started working with Manny Stewart and his style fully started to mature. Yeah, for me, still a lot of work that needed to be done on Lennox Lewis during this stage of his career. And it may well be that his relationship with his trainer was actually holding him back, given some of the flaws that appeared evident in his game at this point. So whilst I'm getting my tin hat ready for the abuse that follows, it's competitive, don't get me wrong, but gun to my head, who would I pick in that fight? I'd pick Tyson Fury. Fury, the far more mature from a technical perspective, the more elusive, the more complete, the smoother boxer. You wouldn't want to rule Lennox out. Lennox had the power to come from behind in fights, and even at this young stage, Lennox was a formidable operator who would have taken risks if needs be, and who would have pushed the pace on Tyson Fury more than Vladimir Klitschko did, in my humble opinion. One final comment I'll make. Lennox Lewis, I know compared to Klitschko, compared to Fury, compared to Wilder, maybe he wasn't as big as those guys, but at the time Lennox Lewis in the 90s considered a monster heavyweight, certainly much bigger than the likes of a Tyson or a Holyfield, one of those sort of guys. Lennox Lewis often used to going in the ring with much smaller men, often used to be considered the giant in there. Given some of the problems that I believe Lennox had with range at this young stage of his career, a guy who was 6'9" with ridiculous footwork, switching from lefty to righty, equally adept on the back foot and then coming forward. For me, it's a bad style matchup for a young Lennox. So, tight fight, could go either way. Wouldn't want to put my life on it. Gun to my head, I'm going Tyson Fury. Let me know your thoughts. Leave your comments in the section below. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up button. If you're new, please subscribe. Many thanks for tuning in.